The day Margaret Whitlock bought the abandoned train depot for $5, three people laughed. The first was the auctioneer, a man who had been required by law to bring the lot to the courthouse steps and had not expected anyone to bid on it, and who laughed in the embarrassed way of a man who had drawn the short straw and was now obligated to pretend the moment was dignified. The second was the deputy assessor from the county, who had been sent to officiate, and who let out a single short bark of disbelief when Maggie raised her hand. The third was her own son, Ronald, who was not present, but who would laugh later when his sister called him from Atlanta to report what their mother had just done. He would laugh on the phone, and he would say, "She's lost it. She has finally lost it, Linda. We told her. We told her something like this would happen." It was a Wednesday morning in March. The air was cold, and the light was that hard, particular light of late winter in the Carolina foothills, the light that shows everything without flattering any of it. Maggie stood on the courthouse steps in the coat Earl had bought her for their 48th anniversary, the pendant he had given her on their 30th around her neck under the collar, and she signed the paper the deputy assessor passed her, and she paid $5 in cash, and she became the legal owner of the Millbrook Junction Depot. She did not feel triumphant. She felt the way a person feels at the beginning of something that is going to be very hard. If this story is already pulling at something in you, hit the like button and subscribe to Left Behind, and drop a comment below telling me where in the world you're watching from. She had almost nothing left. No one knew what was waiting. Keep watching. To understand what Maggie did on that courthouse step, you have to understand the 8 months that came before it, and the 51 years before that, and the man who had spent the last weeks of his life telling her things in a voice that grew quieter every day but never lost its certainty. Earl Whitlock had died on a Tuesday in July, in his armchair, with the morning paper folded across his lap and his reading glasses still on his nose. Maggie had come into the living room to ask what he wanted for breakfast and had stopped in the doorway because she had been married to Earl for 51 years, and she knew the difference between a man dozing and a man who was no longer there. The difference was small and complete. He had not been suffering. He had simply, in the middle of a paragraph about the county budget, decided to stop. It was the most Earl thing he had ever done. He had always finished what he was reading before he did anything else, and that morning he had finished, and then he had gone. She had sat with him for an hour before she called anyone. She had held his hand, which was still warm, and she had told him several things she had been waiting to tell him at a more convenient time, and she had understood, in the slow accumulation of that hour, that the convenient time had been every minute of 51 years, and she had used most of them, and the few she had saved up did not matter as much as she had thought they would, because Earl had known. Earl had always known. The funeral was small. Their son Ronald flew in from Charlotte and stood at the back of the funeral home checking his phone. Their daughter Linda drove up from Atlanta with her husband Greg and the 2 grandchildren, whom Maggie had not seen in 14 months, and who were polite in the careful way of children who have been instructed to be polite, and who are going to leave as soon as the politeness has been demonstrated. The pastor said kind things. The neighbors brought casseroles. Earl was buried beside the plot Maggie had purchased for herself in 1998 on a hill in the Methodist cemetery overlooking the same valley he had grown up in, and afterward everyone went back to the house, and within 90 minutes Ronald was talking about estate planning. He used the phrase several times. Estate planning. He said it the way people say words they have learned recently and are trying out. Estate planning, Mom. We have to think about estate planning. Linda nodded along. They had spoken on the phone. Maggie understood later. They had decided things. The house Earl had built additions onto for 31 years. The house with the kitchen Earl had remodeled in 2007, and the back porch Earl had screened in the summer Linda turned 12, was, Ronald explained, a liability. It was too big for one person. It was too expensive to maintain. It was, more than anything else, an asset that needed to be protected from the various complications that could befall a widow in her 70s who lived alone and might fall, or get confused, or be taken advantage of by someone with a smile and a clipboard. Maggie listened to her son explain her own competence to her in the kitchen Earl had built. She did not interrupt. She had learned during the years of raising Ronald that he could not hear another voice while his own was speaking, and she had stopped trying. What Ronald proposed, with Linda's quiet agreement and Greg's encouraging interjections, was that Maggie signed the house over to a family trust, of which Ronald would be the trustee, and that the house then be sold, and that the proceeds be invested in a way that would generate steady income from Maggie's monthly expenses, and that Maggie move into a small apartment in town where she could be more comfortable and where the maintenance would not be her problem. It was, Ronald said, the sensible thing. It was what Earl would have wanted. Maggie almost said something then. She almost said that Earl had been very specific in his last weeks about what he wanted, and that none of it involved Ronald becoming the trustee of anything. But she did not say it. She did not say it because Earl had warned her, in one of the conversations she had not yet understood, that there would be a moment when her children would arrive with a plan, and she would need to let them think she had agreed to it long enough to make sure she understood what she actually wanted to do. "Don't fight them at the funeral," Earl had said. "Don't fight them in the first month. Fight them when you know what the fight is for." So Maggie nodded. She said, "Let me think about it." She said, "We'll talk." And Ronald, who had a flight to catch, took those answers as agreement, the way he took most answers, and went back to Charlotte. 6 weeks later, she was in the apartment. The papers had moved faster than she had expected. The realtor was a friend of Ronald's. The closing was handled by an attorney Maggie had never met. She signed where she was told to sign. She watched the house she had lived in for 42 years pass into the hands of a young couple from Raleigh who told her they were going to renovate the kitchen. And she did not tell them that the kitchen had been renovated 9 years ago by a man who had built it for the woman he had been married to for 42 years. Because she understood that they would not hear her and that her kitchen was no longer hers, and that the only thing left to do was leave it cleanly, which she did with a casserole in the freezer for the new owners and a note that said, "Welcome home." The proceeds from the sale, after the attorney's fees and the realtor's commission and the various other deductions Ronald had not mentioned at the funeral, came to substantially less than the house had been worth. The investment account Ronald set up generated a monthly transfer to Maggie's checking that was enough to pay rent on the apartment and buy groceries and not much else. When she asked about the principal, Ronald used the phrase "protected from volatility," which she came to understand meant not accessible to her. Linda called twice that fall. Ronald called once. By Thanksgiving, the calls had stopped. Maggie did not call them. She had decided, sometime in October, that she was going to let the silence run its full length, the way you let a wound bleed clean before you bandage it. She wanted to know how long it would last. She wanted to know what kind of children she had raised. The answer, by March, was that she had raised the kind of children who could go 4 months without calling their newly widowed mother and feel no urgency about the gap. She did not feel betrayed, exactly. She felt the way Earl had always said she would feel about certain things, clarified. "They'll show you who they are," Earl had said in his last week, sitting up against the pillows with the slow, deliberate breath of a man rationing his words. "Let them. Don't argue with what they show you." She had not argued. She had simply watched and waited, and 3 months into the apartment, she had begun watching the legal notices in the Millbrook Gazette, the way Earl had told her to. She did not know exactly what she was watching for. She knew only that Earl had said it would come, and that when it came, she would know. In December, he had told her about the depot. He had told her in pieces, over several afternoons. In the careful way he told her important things. Never all at once. Always with rests in between, so that what he was saying could settle. The Millbrook Junction Depot had been built in 1924 by the Carolina Coastal Railway. It had been the smallest manned station on the line, serving the freight needs of the cotton mills and the kaolin operations that had once been the economic backbone of Watauga County. Maggie's grandfather, Wilbur Hayes, had been the station master from 1924 to 1958. He had lived in the small upstairs quarters above the ticket office for 34 years, alone for the last 20 after his wife died, and he had run the depot with the particular precision of a man who had nothing else and therefore put everything into the one thing he had. When the line went bankrupt in 1971, the depot had been boarded up. The land had passed into a tangle of railway receivership claims that had not fully resolved for 50 years. Earl had been watching the case quietly for 2 decades, the way he watched things, without urgency, with patience, and with an understanding that the right moment for any matter eventually arrives if you are willing to wait for it. The case, Earl had told her in December, was finally closing. The county was going to be forced to auction the depot at minimum bid because no other resolution was available. Earl had calculated, with the same precision he brought to everything, that the auction would happen sometime between February and April. Bid $5, he had said. Nobody else will come. The depot is your grandfather's. It should have come to your mother. It should have come to you. It is going to come to you now, and when you walk into it, you will understand things I do not have time to explain. He had said this in the voice of a man who had thought about it for a long time. Maggie had listened the way she had learned to listen to Earl when he was certain. She had not asked questions. She had stored what he told her, the way she stored important things, and she had waited. Now, it was a Wednesday in March. Now the auction had come and gone, and she had a folded piece of paper in her purse that said the Millbrook Junction Depot, all rights and appurtenances, was the property of Margaret Hayes Whitlock for the price of $5 US. She drove out to it that afternoon. The depot sat at the end of Old Rail Road, 2.5 miles from the new bypass, in the kind of forgotten pocket of the county that exists in every county and that nobody has any reason to drive through. The road narrowed, the trees closed in, and then, around a curve, the depot appeared, and Maggie pulled the car to the shoulder and sat for a moment, looking at it through the windshield. It was worse than she remembered. It was also exactly the same. The building was small, a single-story brick structure with a peaked slate roof and a covered platform running along the track side, the platform sagging now where the supports had rotted. The brick was sound. She could see that, the work of 1920s masons who had built things to outlast them. The slate roof was mostly intact, with a few missing tiles. The windows had been boarded up so long that the boards themselves had gone gray and were beginning to give back to weather. A sign hung crooked above the platform, the lettering nearly gone, but Maggie remembered what it said because she had stood under it as a child holding her grandfather's hand. Millbrook Junction, CCRY. Behind the depot, where the rails had once been, there was now only a long, low ridge of gravel running through the trees, the ghost of the line, the ground itself remembering what was no longer there. She got out of the car. She walked across the cracked asphalt of the small lot. She climbed the 3 concrete steps to the platform door. The main door, the one passengers had used when there had been passengers. The padlock the county had hung on the door was newer than the door itself, but old in its own right, rusted to the point where it would not have held against any serious effort. She had brought bolt cutters from the apartment, the ones Earl had kept in the trunk of the car for 40 years, and she cut the padlock off with 2 careful cuts, and the lock fell in her hand, and she put it in her coat pocket because it seemed wrong to leave it on the ground. The door took some persuading. The wood had swollen against the frame. She put her shoulder to it the way Earl had shown her to put her shoulder to stuck doors, and on the 3rd try it gave, and she stepped inside. The smell was the first thing. The specific contained smell of a building closed for 50 years. Not unpleasant, just complete. The smell of old wood and cold stone, and the particular mineral quality of a place that has held its own air for a very long time. Light came through the gaps in the boarded windows in long pale stripes that made the dust visible. She stood inside the front room, the public waiting area, where the ticket window had been, and let her eyes adjust. The room was exactly as her grandfather had left it. That was not a metaphor. The room was exactly as her grandfather had left it. The wooden benches still ran along the 2 side walls. The ticket window was closed and shuttered, but the shutter was original, and beside it the schedule board still hung, the slats still bearing the painted destinations and times of trains that had not run in 53 years. A pot-belly stove sat in the center of the room, its flue still rising into the ceiling, the brass nameplate on its door still readable. Acme Foundry, 1923. On a small table beside the stove, where a station master might have set his coffee, there was a porcelain mug. The mug was upright, undisturbed, with a faint dark ring at the bottom where the last coffee had dried into the glaze. Maggie crossed the room slowly. She picked up the mug. She turned it over. On the bottom, in her grandfather's careful hand, the same hand she remembered from birthday cards and from the labels he had written on the seed packets in his garden, was a single word painted on with the small brush he had used for the schedule board. Margaret. She set the mug down. She put her hand on the table to steady herself. Then she sat on the bench against the wall, in the cold, in the dust, in the long, pale stripes of March light, and she understood that whatever Earl had been waiting for her to find, this was not yet it. This was only the beginning of it. This was the door. She sat for a long time. Then she stood up, and she walked through the depot the way she had been taught to walk through important things, slowly, paying attention, and she began to make a list in her head of what she was going to need. The upstairs quarters were reached by a narrow staircase behind the ticket window, a staircase Maggie had not been allowed to climb when she was a child because her grandfather had said the upstairs was where he lived and where a station master kept the things that were his alone. She had been 6 the last time she had stood at the bottom of those stairs. She had been 6, and she had asked, and he had said, "Not yet, Margaret, when you're older, when you need to." And then he had died in 1962 without ever inviting her up, and she had grown up, and she had gotten older, and she had not, until this Wednesday in March, needed to. The stairs creaked under her weight. They held. At the top, there was a small landing and one door, and the door was locked, and the lock was not the kind the county had put on the front. This was an older lock, brass, the kind you could buy in the 1920s in any railway supply catalog, and it was locked with a key, and Maggie did not have the key. She stood on the landing for a long time. Then she walked back down the stairs and across the waiting room and out to her car, and she sat in the driver's seat and opened her purse and took out the small leather pouch Earl had given her on the morning he died. She had not opened it. She had carried it with her every day since July without opening it because Earl had said, "When you find the door you cannot open, this is what you will need," and she had understood that to open the pouch before she had found the door would be a kind of theft from her own future. So she had carried it, and she had waited, and now there was a door. Inside the pouch was a single brass key. It was old. The teeth were worn smooth in places. On the bow of the key, in the same painted hand as the porcelain mug, was the name Wilbur Hayes and a date, 1924. Earl had had her grandfather's key. For 62 years, in the back of a drawer somewhere, Earl had had her grandfather's key, and he had never said. She walked back up the stairs. She turned the key in the lock. The lock turned smoothly, as if it had been oiled, which she understood a moment later that it had been, recently, in the last few years, by someone who had been keeping it ready. The door opened. The room behind it was the room her grandfather had lived in for 34 years, and then died in, and then waited in. A single bed against the far wall, made up with a quilt Maggie recognized. Her grandmother had pieced it the year before she died. The wedding ring pattern in blues and creams, the binding her grandmother's small, precise stitching. A small writing desk under the window. A wardrobe in the corner. A washstand. A bookshelf with maybe 40 books on it, mostly railway timetables and almanacs and a Bible. A small coal stove that had been cold for 50 years. And against the inside wall, beside the desk, a steel safe, the kind that sat on the floor and was as tall as a person's hip, painted black with gold lettering across the door. Mosler's Safe and Lock Co., Hamilton, Ohio. The safe had a combination dial. Maggie did not know the combination. She sat at the desk. The desk was bare, swept clean, except for a single envelope placed in the center, the way the mug downstairs had been placed in the center of its table. The envelope had her name on it. Margaret, not in her grandfather's hand, in Earl's. She opened it. Maggie, if you're reading this, you found the depot, and you found the upstairs, and you used the key. That means everything is going where it needs to go. The combination on the safe is your mother's birthday, the way she wrote it. Month, day, year, 2 digits each. Your grandfather said it the day she was born, and he never changed it. He told me this himself in 1958, 3 years before he died, in the only conversation we ever had about the depot. I was 26. I was about to marry his granddaughter. He told me to remember it, and to wait, and to keep it for you until the day you would need it. I have kept it for 68 years. I'm sorry I cannot give it to you in person. I wanted to. The timing did not allow. What is in the safe is yours. It has always been yours. Your grandfather left it for you the way I am leaving this letter for you, patiently and without explanation, because some inheritances arrive only when the person receiving them is ready. You are ready, Earl. She read it 3 times. Then she folded it carefully and put it in her coat pocket, and she knelt in front of the safe, and she turned the dial to her mother's birthday, August 14th, 1929, 08-14-29, and she felt the tumblers fall into place with the same small certainty as the lock turning upstairs, the certainty of mechanisms that have been waiting. The safe opened. Inside were three things. The first was a leather satchel, heavy, the kind that bank couriers had used in the early part of the 20th century. When Maggie lifted it onto the desk and opened it, what she found inside were bound packets of currency and bond certificates. Not the worthless paper of a defunct railway, but United States Treasury bonds and denominations she had to count twice to believe, dated across 40 years, the earliest from 1934 and the latest from 1957. Her grandfather had been a careful man. He had worked for 34 years at a station that, by the end, was barely operating, and he had spent almost nothing. And what he had not spent he had converted, year by year, into instruments that would not lose their value to the kind of bank failures he had watched destroy his neighbors in the 1930s. The bonds had been compounding in their dark safe for between 68 and 90 years. If this story has found its way to you, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss a new story from Left Behind. Your support is what keeps these stories coming, and there are so many more waiting to be told. Maggie did not know, kneeling there in the cold upstairs of the depot, exactly what those bonds were worth. She knew enough to understand that it was not a small number. She knew enough to understand that her grandfather had spent his quiet life accumulating something he intended to give to a child he had only known for the first 6 years of her life, and that he had trusted Earl with the secret, and that Earl had trusted her, in the end, to find her way to it. The second thing in the safe was a folder of documents, tied with a blue ribbon. Land deeds, original surveys, the 1924 grant from the state of North Carolina to the Carolina Coastal Railway for the depot parcel, and attached to it, the 1958 quitclaim that her grandfather had executed in his last year, transferring the depot parcel and the 11 adjoining acres of right-of-way back to himself in his personal capacity, before the railway's bankruptcy could absorb it. 11 acres. 11 acres that ran along the old rail bed. 11 acres that the county had carried on its books for 53 years as railway land in receivership and had never once thought to question, because nobody had cared enough about a defunct depot to look. 11 acres that, 2.5 miles from the new bypass, in the path of the commercial development the county had been planning for a decade, were not worthless at all. Earl had known. Earl had been watching the bypass plans for 20 years. The third thing in the safe was a small wooden box. Inside the box, wrapped in tissue, was a pocket watch. Her grandfather's. She recognized it from the only photograph she had of him as a young man. And beneath the watch, a folded sheet of paper in her grandfather's hand, written in 1958, addressed to my granddaughter Margaret, when she is ready. Margaret, it said, what I have left is not much by the standards of the world your parents will raise you in. But it is everything I had, and I want you to have it, because you are the only one in my line who will care for the depot. I do not know how I know this. I knew it the first time you climbed the platform steps. You stood and you looked at the schedule board and you asked me what every word meant. The others never asked. You will ask and you will care, and what is here will be yours. Do not let anyone tell you it is not. Do not let anyone manage it for you. It is yours. Grandfather. She sat at the desk for a long time with the three things on the surface in front of her and the cold March light coming through the window onto her hands. Then she closed the safe. She put the satchel and the folder and the box back inside, and she spun the dial, and she stood up, and she went downstairs and out into the lot and got in her car and drove the 7 miles back to the apartment in town, and she did not call anyone, and she did not tell anyone because Earl had told her in the last week that the most important thing she would ever do with this information was decide who to tell and when, and that the wrong order would cost her everything. She did not tell Ronald. She did not tell Linda. She told one person. His name was Howard Pratt, and he had been Earl's attorney for 31 years, and he had been at the funeral, and he had pressed a card into Maggie's hand at the reception and said, when you need me, call. Not before. When? She had kept the card. She called the number on a Thursday morning. She told him, in the careful way she told important things, what she had found. Howard Pratt was quiet for a long moment on the other end of the line. Then he said, Mrs. Whitlock, your husband and I had several conversations over the last 3 years. I have a file. I have been waiting for your call. Can you come to my office on Monday morning? She went on Monday morning. What Howard Pratt told her, across his desk, with Earl's file open between them, was that Earl had spent the last 6 years of his life quietly preparing for exactly this. He had paid for title searches. He had paid for surveys. He had paid for an environmental assessment of the 11 acres. He had paid for an appraisal that valued the parcel conservatively at $1.7 million. He had paid for a separate appraisal of the depot building itself, which the State Historic Preservation Office had already designated as eligible for the National Register, a designation that would qualify any restoration for substantial federal tax credits. He had paid for all of this in cash, from an account Maggie had not known existed, and he had instructed Howard Pratt to hold the file until Maggie called. He had also, Howard Pratt said carefully, set up a separate trust in Maggie's name only, not the family trust Ronald administered, a different one, with Howard Pratt as trustee and Maggie as the sole beneficiary, into which the proceeds of the house sale had partially been redirected without Ronald's knowledge, through a clause in Earl's will that Ronald's attorney, in his haste to close the estate, had not flagged. You have more money than your son believes you have, Howard Pratt said. You have considerably more, and you have a property your son does not know you own. Maggie sat with this for a moment. Then she said, he'll find out. Yes, Howard Pratt said. Eventually. How long do I have? Howard Pratt looked at his calendar. The depot purchase is public record. It will appear in the legal notices in tomorrow's Gazette. Your son reads the Gazette online, I believe. He does. Then you have until tomorrow. She drove back to the apartment. She did not sleep that night. She sat at the small kitchen table she had brought from the house, and she wrote a list, the way Earl had taught her to write lists when there were too many things to hold in her head at once. What I need to do first. What I need to do next. Who I need on my side. The phone rang at 7:15 the next morning. It was Ronald. His voice was the voice she remembered from his teenage years, the voice he used when he had decided, before the conversation began, that she was wrong. Mom, he said, what did you do? She did not answer right away. She poured her coffee. She sat at the table. She let the silence run, the way Earl had taught her to let silences run when the other person was waiting for her to fill them. Mom, Ronald said again, I'm looking at the paper. Did you buy a building? I bought the depot, she said. The depot. He laughed. It was the same laugh he had used as a teenager when he had decided something was beneath him. Mom, what is that even? That's a pile of bricks. That's a liability. Do you have any idea what that's going to cost you to demolish? You can't just buy things. You have a fixed income. Linda and I set up a budget for you for a reason. I know why you set it up, she said. There was a pause on the other end. Something in her voice had been different from what he had expected, and Ronald, for the first time in a long time, had to recalibrate. Mom, he said, and his voice softened in the careful way it softened when he was about to manage her. Mom, look, I'm flying down this weekend. We're going to sit down, and we're going to figure this out. I think you may have made an impulsive decision, and that's understandable. You've been through a lot. We can probably get the sale reversed. $5 that's not a real transaction, technically. We can probably argue diminished. We can argue that the auction was improperly noticed, and, Ronald, she said. He stopped. Don't fly down, she said. I am busy this weekend. She hung up. He called back 4 times that morning. She did not answer. He called Linda. Linda called her. Maggie did not answer Linda either. She drove out to the depot with a thermos of coffee and a notebook, and she sat on the platform bench in the cold March sun, and she made the list of contractors Howard Pratt had given her, and she began the work. The work took 18 months. She did not do it alone. She hired the people Howard Pratt recommended, a restoration architect from Asheville who specialized in railway buildings, a mason whose grandfather had worked on the original depot, a roofer who knew slate, a carpenter from the next county whose work Earl had admired for years. She hired locally where she could. She paid in cash from the trust Earl had set up, and she paid promptly, and she paid fairly, and the word got around the way the word gets around in small counties, that the Whitlock widow, the one whose children had moved her into an apartment, was restoring the old depot and was paying real money and was not to be condescended to. The town watched. The town had things to say. Some of what the town said was kind. The pastor at Maggie's church came out to the depot in April and walked the platform with her and said simply, "Earl would be proud." Some of the older townspeople, the ones who remembered Wilbur Hayes, the ones who had ridden the line as children, came by with photographs from family albums, and Maggie made copies, and she began, almost without intending to assemble an archive. Some of what the town said was less kind. There were people who said she had lost her judgment. There were people who said her children should intervene. There were people who told Ronald, when he finally drove down in May with Linda and an attorney and a plan, that his mother was throwing money away on that ruin, and Ronald arrived at the depot on a Saturday morning in May with the full confidence of a man who had been told what he wanted to hear. Maggie was on the platform when he pulled in. She was holding a clipboard. The mason was repointing the brick on the south wall. The roofer was on a ladder. There were 4 trucks in the lot. Ronald got out of his car. Linda got out of the passenger side. The attorney, a different one this time, a man Maggie had never seen, got out of the back. They walked across the lot toward her, and Maggie watched them come, and she did not move from where she stood, and she did not put down the clipboard. "Mom," Ronald said, "we need to talk." "All right," she said. "Privately." "No," she said. "Whatever you want to say, you can say in front of the people who are doing the work." Ronald looked at the mason. The mason did not look up. He had been told, the day before, by Maggie, that her son was likely coming, and that he should keep working, and he was a man who took instructions well. "Mom," Ronald said, and his voice was lower now, more careful. "We've spoken to an attorney. We're concerned about the financial decisions you've been making. We think, Howard Pratt," Maggie said. Ronald stopped. "What?" "Howard Pratt is my attorney. You can have your attorney call him. He's expecting the call. He's been expecting it since March." The attorney with Ronald looked at his shoes. He had not been told this part. He had been told that Maggie was an elderly woman acting impulsively, and he had been retained to suggest, gently, that her judgment might be impaired and that a conservatorship might be in everyone's interest. He had not been told that Maggie had her own attorney, and that her attorney was Howard Pratt, who every attorney in 3 counties knew by reputation, and who did not lose. "Mom," Linda said, and her voice was the voice she had used as a child when she had wanted something and Ronald had told her to ask. "Mom, please. We just want to understand." Maggie looked at her daughter. She had not seen Linda since the funeral. Linda had lost weight. Her hair was different. She looked tired in a way Maggie had not noticed at the funeral, because she had been too busy being tired herself. "Linda," she said, "when did you last call me before this morning?" Linda did not answer. "It was October," Maggie said. "It was October the 14th. You called to tell me you couldn't make Thanksgiving. The call lasted 11 minutes. You did not ask how I was. You told me, and you hung up, and I have not heard from you since. That was 5 months ago. I am asking you now, on the platform of a building you have come here to take from me, whether you would like to ask me how I am." Linda's eyes filled. She opened her mouth. She closed it. "You don't have to," Maggie said. "I am only telling you that the question was available and that you have not yet asked it, and that it is interesting to me that you have come all this way, and the first thing you said to me was please." She turned to Ronald. "The depot," she said, "is mine. The land is mine. The trust is mine. None of it goes through the family trust you administer. None of it is reachable by you. Howard Pratt has the documents. Your attorney can call him on Monday. If you'd like to come inside and have a cup of coffee with me, you may. If you'd like to leave, you may do that as well. What you may not do is stand on this platform and tell the people who are working for me that I have lost my judgment, because they will keep working for me regardless, and you will look smaller than you already do." Ronald stared at her. He had not heard her speak this way in his life. He had heard her be patient. He had heard her be tired. He had heard her be quiet. He had not heard her be complete, and the completeness was what he could not absorb, because the version of his mother he had built his plans around did not include it. He turned, after a moment, to the attorney. The attorney shook his head once, a small, professional shake, and walked back toward the car. Linda was still standing where she had stood. She was crying now, quietly, in a way she had cried as a child when she had done something wrong and did not know how to undo it. "I didn't know," Linda said. "You didn't ask," Maggie said. "Mom." "Linda, I am not angry. I am clarified. There's a difference. Your brother brought you here to help him take something from me, and he did not tell you what was actually happening, because he never tells you what is actually happening, and you came along because you have always come along. I am telling you here on this platform that you do not have to come along anymore. You can come inside if you want. You can sit with me. You can ask me how I am. Or you can get back in the car with your brother. That is your choice. It has always been your choice. I'm only naming it now. Linda stood for a long moment. She looked at the depot. She looked at her mother. She looked at her brother, who was already walking back to the car, and who did not turn around to see whether she was following. She came inside. She sat with Maggie at the small table by the stove, the same table where the porcelain mug had been waiting, and Maggie made coffee on the camp stove she had set up while the kitchen was being rebuilt, and Linda asked her, finally, "How are you, Mom?" And Maggie told her. She told her about the 8 months in the apartment. She told her about the legal notices she had been watching. She told her about the auction and the $5 and the upstairs and the safe and what was in it. She told her about Earl's letter and Howard Pratt and the trust. She told her, without softening any of it, what Ronald had done with the house and what Howard Pratt had told her about the proceeds and how much of what Ronald believed he controlled, he did not. Linda listened. She did not interrupt. When Maggie finished, Linda was quiet for a long time. Then Linda said, "Greg left me in November." Maggie put down her coffee. "I lost the house," Linda said. "We were upside down on it. I lost it in February. The kids are with me in an apartment in Marietta. I have been trying to figure out how to tell you. I did not call because I did not want to call when you were grieving and tell you that I was failing." Maggie reached across the table and took her daughter's hand. "Linda," she said, "listen to me. You are not failing. You are 47 years old, and your husband left you, and you lost your house, and you have 2 children to raise, and you are doing it. That is not failing. That is the work. The work is what failing looks like from the outside, when you do not know what you're looking at." Linda cried, properly this time, the way she had not cried at the funeral and the way she had not let herself cry in 5 months. And Maggie held her hand across the table in the depot her grandfather had built, and outside the mason kept working, and the slate kept going up, and the long, slow, 18-month restoration kept moving forward. Ronald did not come inside. He sat in the car for 40 minutes, and then he drove away. He did not call for 3 weeks. When he finally called, it was to ask, in a voice that did not quite belong to him, whether he could come down and see the depot. Maggie said yes. She did not say more than that. She had decided, sometime in the weeks after the platform conversation, that what she owed Ronald was a door and not a path. He could walk through the door if he chose. He could stand outside it. That was his work, and it was not hers. He came in June. He stood on the platform. He looked at the brick, the slate, the new windows, the platform supports the carpenter had milled from oak to match the originals. He did not say much. He shook the mason's hand. He shook Howard Pratt's hand when Howard came by that afternoon to deliver papers. He had dinner with Maggie at the diner in town, and he asked her, near the end of the meal, the question she had been waiting for him to ask. "Why didn't you tell me, Mom?" "Because you never asked," she said. "Because for 14 years, every time we spoke, you told me what I should do. You did not ask me what I was doing. I was doing things, Ronald. I was doing them the whole time. You did not know because you were not curious. I'm not punishing you for that. I'm only telling you that the way you find out what your mother is doing is to ask her." He did not answer. He paid the check. He drove her home. At the door of the apartment, he hugged her, the first real hug he had given her since Earl's funeral, and he said, "I'll call." He did call. He called on Sundays after that, irregularly at first, and then more steadily. He never became the son Maggie might have wished for, but he became a son who called, which was more than he had been, and Maggie had lived long enough to understand that more than he had been is the only honest measure of growth. The depot opened to the public on a Saturday in October, 18 months after the auction. She did not open it as a museum, though that was what most of the town had expected. She opened it as a working community space, the upstairs preserved as her grandfather had left it, accessible by appointment, the downstairs restored as a small cafe and railway library and meeting room, with the original schedule board kept on the wall and the porcelain mug in a glass case on the counter. The 11 acres became a public greenway, donated to the county on the condition that it be preserved, with a small plaque at the entrance that read in memory of Wilbur Hayes, station master, 1924 to 1958, and Earl Whitlock, who waited. The opening was attended by more people than Maggie had expected. The pastor came. Howard Pratt came. The mason and the roofer and the carpenter came with their families. Linda came with the grandchildren, who had moved with her into the small house Maggie had bought for them, 2 streets from the depot, 6 months earlier. Ronald came with his wife. The auctioneer came too, the same man who had laughed in March a year and a half earlier. He did not laugh this time. He shook Maggie's hand on the platform and said, "Mrs. Whitlock, I owe you an apology," and Maggie said, "No, you don't. You did your job. You didn't know." And she meant it, because by then she had stopped keeping the list of who had laughed and had started keeping a different list, the one Earl had taught her to keep, the one with only the names of the people who had shown up. She kept that list in a notebook on the desk upstairs, beside her grandfather's pocket watch, in the room where he had lived for 34 years. The list grew slowly. Most lists worth keeping do. She lived in the apartment for another year, and then she moved into the upstairs of the depot, into the room her grandfather had lived in, with new heat and new wiring and the original quilt washed and put back on the bed. She wound the pocket watch every morning. She made coffee in her grandfather's mug, the one that had her name on the bottom, the one that had been waiting for her on the table by the stove for 53 years. She watched the seasons change through the same window he had watched them through. She was, in a way she had not expected and could not have planned for, home. Linda lived 2 streets away. The grandchildren came to the depot after school. Ronald called on Sundays. Howard Pratt came for coffee on Tuesdays. The town stopped saying she had lost her judgment. The town began to say, instead, the thing the town says about the people it has finally understood, that she had known what she was doing all along. She had not, exactly. She had only trusted Earl and her grandfather before him, and she had paid attention, and she had waited. That was the lesson, she thought sometimes, sitting on the platform in the long evening light, watching the greenway where the rails had been. That was the whole lesson, if there was one. That what is left behind by people who knew, and the people who knew chose carefully, and the choosing is what survives. The depot had been waiting for her since 1924. The mug had been waiting since 1958. The key had been waiting since Earl had taken it from her grandfather's hand the year before he married her. None of it had been lost. It had only been waiting for the person who would come back for it. She had come back. That was the thing nobody else had understood, not Ronald, not the auctioneer, not the town, not even in the beginning herself. She had come back. And what comes back to a forgotten place is not a stranger. It is the one person the place has been holding itself together to receive. The depot held its first community supper on the first Saturday in November. The room was full. Linda served. The grandchildren ran between the tables. Ronald sat at the long table by the stove and spoke quietly with Howard Pratt about something that made them both laugh. Maggie stood at the schedule board and looked at the room, at the brick her grandfather had laid, at the slate Earl had paid for in advance without telling her, at the people who had come, and the people who had stayed, and the absence of the people who had not, which was its own kind of presence, and which she had stopped grieving sometime in the second summer of the work. She put her hand on the schedule board, where the painted destinations of trains that no longer ran were preserved under a layer of conservator's varnish. She felt, through the wood, the small, steady thrum of the building doing what it had been built to do, which was to hold people briefly on their way somewhere, and to be there when they came back. She had come back. That was enough. That had always been enough. Thank you for sitting with this story all the way to the end. The people who stay for the whole story are the ones who understand it. If it moved you, the videos on your screen right now are waiting to do the same. And if you haven't subscribed yet, come home. Left Behind has a story for you.